Long before Disney bought up half of Orlando, Florida was already covered in roadside attractions, built by regular people chasing a big idea and a highway full of tourists. Wax museums, animal parks, pirate ships, a whole miniature version of China. Most of them are gone now, bulldozed, auctioned off, or just left to rot behind a chain link fence. So today, we're counting down 10 abandoned Florida attractions Americans forgot about. Number 10, Africa, USA, Boca Raton. Nearly 4 decades before Disney's Animal Kingdom opened with its cageless safari concept, a Wisconsin transplant named John Peterson was already doing it in Boca Raton. Peterson purchased 300 acres of land from the city and Palm Beach County in 1950, and on March 10, 1953, opened Africa, USA, a genuinely free-roaming wildlife park where visitors toured by open-air tram or boat past giraffes, zebras, and big cats wandering loose across the property. His son Jack traveled to Kenya to help arrange what was reportedly the largest single shipment of African animals ever to leave the continent by ship. The park was a legitimate sensation, pulling in around 300,000 visitors a year and landing on the cover of Life magazine in August of 1960. The same year Disneyland was passed over for that particular cover. Walt Disney himself reportedly visited Africa, USA more than once and considered buying it outright. But success brought its own problems. As Boca Raton grew up around the park, new residents complained loudly about noise and traffic, and a prolonged legal fight with the Department of Agriculture over an alleged tick infestation on the animals wore Peterson down. He sold the park, and it closed for good on September 4, 1961, with the animals auctioned off to zoos across the country. The land is now the Camino Gardens residential neighborhood, though part of the original lagoon and waterfall still sits there, marked only by a small plaque. Palm Beach County historian Ginger Pedersen, John's granddaughter, later described the era Africa USA belonged to as a time when roadside attractions dotted US 1 up and down the coast, and families treated stopping at them as a genuine part of their vacation itinerary rather than an afterthought. A few relatives of the original owners have since suggested the tick infestation story wasn't the whole picture, pointing instead toward a lingering dispute over a giraffe import case the Pedersons had actually won against the Department of Agriculture a few years earlier, and which some believe left lasting friction with local officials. Either way, by the time Boca Raton had grown into the polished, affluent city it's known as today, almost nobody driving past Camino Gardens would guess that lions and giraffes once roamed freely across that exact patch of land. Number 9. Pirates World, Dania Beach. Pirates World opened April 8, 1967, in what's now Dania Beach, built on roughly 100 acres between US 1 and A1A by the Recreation Corporation of America. It had a genuine pirate ship sailing a lagoon, a log flume, a relocated antique wooden coaster from Coney Island called the Grand National Steeplechase, and an observation tower repurposed from the 1964 New York World's Fair. For a few years, it was one of South Florida's biggest family destinations, and it doubled as a concert venue that hosted acts like Led Zeppelin, The Grateful Dead, and Black Sabbath. Then, in October of 1971, Walt Disney World opened a few hours north, and attendance at Pirates World collapsed almost immediately. Safety problems didn't help either. The steeplechase coaster had a habit of housing rattlesnakes in its wooden horses during the off-season, and in 1973, the park's concert auditorium was shut down entirely after inspectors found its roof construction unsafe. Pirates World filed for bankruptcy that same year and closed for good, with local officials formally condemning what remained of the site by 1975. A proposal to build a biblical-themed park called God's World on the same land in 1978 raised only a few $1,000s before collapsing. Condominiums cover the site today. The park's brief run as a concert venue left behind a genuinely unusual legacy of its own. Between the amusement rides and the pirate ship, Pirates World's outdoor auditorium hosted acts that would go on to become some of the biggest names in rock history, drawing crowds as large as 9,000 teenagers for a single show, according to local reporting from the time. Local law enforcement, including then-Sheriff Ed Stack, had already been pushing to have the park declared a public nuisance well before the safety violations finally gave officials the legal opening they needed to shut the concert hall down for good. Pirates World also dabbled briefly in film production, releasing a handful of low-budget children's movies under its own name, most of which faded into obscurity almost immediately, with the notable exception of a holiday feature called Santa and the Three Bears, which found a modest afterlife on home video well into the 1980s, long after the park itself had been bulldozed. Number 8. Six Gun Territory, Ocala. Six Gun Territory opened February 2, 1963, near Ocala, the brainchild of R.B. Coburn's Western Heritage USA Corporation, and quickly became one of Florida's single most popular tourist draws during the golden age of television westerns. Spread across 200 acres, the fully built-out Old West town included more than 40 structures, from a saloon with can-can dance shows to a working jail, a courthouse, a blacksmith shop, and a Mexican border town complete with its own cantina and casino. Staged gunfights and train robberies ran throughout the day, powered by a genuine narrow-gauge steam railroad. Some of the most popular attractions inside the park included the Palace Saloon and Theater, with its regular can-can dance performances, staged shootouts, and mock bank robberies that ran multiple times a day, and a replica Mexican border town, complete with its own casino, market, and cantina. A skyride gondola carried visitors over the grounds for an aerial view of the whole layout, and the park's steam train doubled as both transportation and entertainment, since robbery reenactments along the tracks were a regular part of the experience. It was, by most contemporary accounts, one of the most fully immersive themed environments Florida had to offer at the time, roughly a decade before Disney would popularize that same kind of total environmental theming on a vastly larger scale just up the road. The park thrived through the 1960s, popular enough that surrounding motels and restaurants started adopting Western themes just to associate themselves with it. But two things eventually caught up with Six Gun Territory. Westerns fell out of fashion on television through the 1970s, and Walt Disney World's 1971 opening, followed a few years later by SeaWorld, pulled visitors toward Orlando instead. After Coburn sold the park in 1970 and it passed through a series of owners with mixed management, Six Gun Territory closed permanently on January 1, 1984. Its assets were auctioned off that April, including the steam locomotives, which were sold out of state for $225,000. The property is now a shopping plaza and residential neighborhood, though the town of Ocala eventually got the park's old four-faced courthouse clock back as a donation. R.B. Coburn, the park's founder, wasn't a one-off operator either. He built a small chain of similarly themed Wild West parks under the Western Heritage banner, including Ghost Town in the Sky in Maggie Valley, North Carolina, and Frontierland in Cherokee, North Carolina, both of which shared a similar staged gunfight, can-can dancer style of entertainment with the Ocala location. Decades after the Ocala Park's closure, the nostalgia around it proved durable enough that a nearby operation called Kirby Family Farm in Williston began hosting an annual Six Gun Territory reunion weekend, starting in 2015. Drawing back former performers and gunfighters alongside longtime fans who hadn't seen each other in 40 years. It's a rare case among Florida's lost attractions where the fandom effectively outlived the property by decades. Number 7. Circus World and Boardwalk and Baseball, Haines City. Few Florida attractions had a stranger set of lives than the property at the intersection of Interstate 4 and US 27 near Haines City. It started in 1974 as Circus World, developed by the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus as both a theme park and a new winter headquarters, complete with an IMAX theater inside a building shaped like a circus tent. Owned in succession by Mattel, then a private developer, the circus-themed park never quite found its footing and closed on May 10, 1986. Publisher Harcourt Brace Jovanovich bought the property and completely reimagined it, spending roughly $50 million to reopen it on February 14, 1987, as Boardwalk and Baseball, an Atlantic City-inspired amusement park built around baseball exhibits, some featuring artifacts borrowed from the actual Baseball Hall of Fame. It briefly employed close to 900 people, making it one of Polk County's largest employers at the time. It didn't last. Harcourt Brace Jovanovich sold its theme park division, including SeaWorld and Cypress Gardens, to Anheuser-Busch's Busch Entertainment Corporation in September of 1989, and the new owners closed Boardwalk and Baseball on January 17, 1990, reportedly with some patrons still inside the gates at closing time. The baseball stadium lingered on for a while, hosting the Kansas City Royals spring training program until 2002, but the rest of the site was demolished and eventually redeveloped into a shopping and residential complex called Posner Park. Even during its baseball-themed years, the park never fully escaped its circus roots. The original Circus tent-shaped IMAX theater from the Circus World era survived the rebrand entirely intact and continued operating as one of the park's attractions right through Boardwalk and baseball's final days, only being demolished years later, sometime between 2002 and 2005, well after the rest of the theme park had already been cleared. Reporting on the park's closure at the time noted that neither die-hard baseball fans nor casual tourists ever quite embraced the new theme the way HBJ had hoped, and that ongoing competition from SeaWorld, Busch Gardens, and Cypress Gardens, all larger and better funded, made it almost impossible for a mid-sized regional park built around a single sport to carve out its own lasting niche in Central Florida's increasingly crowded tourism market. Number 6. Xanadu, home of the future, Kissimmee. Inspired partly by the futuristic energy surrounding Epcot's 1982 opening a few miles away, architect Roy Mason built Xanadu, a domed polyurethane foam computerized home of tomorrow, which opened to the public in Kissimmee in 1983. Constructed by spraying insulating foam over giant inflated balloons rather than pouring concrete, the 6,000-square-foot house was packed with some of the earliest examples of home automation technology available at the time. At its peak in the mid-1980s, Xanadu drew as many as 1,000 visitors a day, all curious to see what the future of home living was supposed to look like. It didn't age well, in either the literal or figurative sense. The polyurethane construction that made Xanadu quick and cheap to build also made it poorly suited to Florida's heat and humidity over the long term, and the futuristic technology inside became laughably outdated within just a few years. Two sister houses in Wisconsin Dells and Gatlinburg, Tennessee, had already closed and been demolished by the early 1990s. Kissimmee's Xanadu held on until 1996, briefly serving as office and storage space afterward, before mold and structural decay made it unusable. It sat abandoned for nearly a decade, attracting homeless squatters and urban explorers before being fully demolished in October of 2005. The interior spaces themselves were part of the appeal and, eventually, part of the problem. Xanadu's rooms were built with sweeping, cave-like curved walls rather than standard flat ones, since the entire structure had originally taken shape by spraying quick-setting foam over giant inflated balloons, rather than framing it the conventional way. Visitors touring the house in its prime could see rudimentary computer-controlled lighting, primitive voice-activated systems, and other novelties that felt genuinely cutting-edge in 1983, but read as almost quaint by the time home computers actually became commonplace in American households a decade later. By the time it was demolished in 2005, urban explorers documenting its final years described an interior soaked through with mold, littered with abandoned furniture, and generally unrecognizable as the gleaming showcase home it had once been marketed as. Number 5. Ocean World, Fort Lauderdale. Ocean World opened in July of 1965 along the 17th Street Causeway in Fort Lauderdale, centered on a 3-story circular tank nicknamed Davy Jones's Locker, where porpoises, sea lions, and sea turtles performed daily shows for crowds of up to 800 people. Visitors could hand-feed the dolphins, watch sharks swim in a surrounding moat, and later, as the park expanded, interact with an assortment of otters, birds, and even an alligator. One of the park's dolphins, Dimples, was marketed as the only dolphin in the world capable of a triple forward somersault. By the 1980s, though, growing scrutiny of marine mammal captivity started catching up with Ocean World. Animal rights activists targeted the park specifically, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture eventually fined it $20,000 over care violations. Attendance declined steadily through the early 1990s, and with little room left to expand on its cramped 6-acre lot, Ocean World's president cited both falling visitor numbers and space limitations when announcing the park's closure. Its final dolphin and sea lion show ran on August 31, 1994, after 29 years in operation. The park's remaining dolphins were reportedly relocated to a marine park in Honduras. Ocean World's original owner, a Fort Lauderdale businessman named Beckwith, ran the attraction for nearly 2 decades before selling it in 1984 to Education Management Corporation, the same company that owned the local Fort Lauderdale Art Institute, which operated the park for its final 10 years. Longtime visitors interviewed decades later in local retrospectives tended to remember the place less for the shows themselves and more for how hands-on the whole experience was, describing being able to personally feed dolphins and sea lions and, during slower periods, work through the same routines the trainers used with the animals. That kind of unguarded, up-close access to marine mammals, charming as it may have felt to families at the time, is almost exactly the practice that animal welfare advocates spent the 1980s campaigning against. And it's a big part of why parks built on that model largely disappeared from the American tourism landscape by the following decade. Number 4, Splendid China, Kissimmee. Opened in December of 1993 just down the road from Walt Disney World, Splendid China was a genuinely one-of-a-kind attraction. A $100 million, 76-acre miniature recreation of more than 60 of China's most famous landmarks, all built at 1/10 scale by roughly 120 imported artisans over 2 years of construction. The centerpiece was a half-mile replica of the Great Wall, painstakingly assembled from 6.5 million individually laid miniature bricks. Despite the obvious craftsmanship, Splendid China struggled from nearly the start. While neighboring Disney and Universal parks routinely drew well over 100,000 guests a day, Splendid China sometimes saw as few as 100 visitors in a single day, in part because it had almost none of the rides, shows, or thrill attractions American tourists had come to expect. Political controversy compounded the business problem, as the park's ties to the Chinese government-owned China Travel Service drew regular protests from Tibetan and Uyghur activists throughout the 1990s. The park lost an estimated $9 million a year by 1999. A brief management shakeup couldn't turn things around, and after attendance cratered further in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, Splendid China closed permanently on December 31st, 2003. Its contents were auctioned off in stages through 2004, and the property sat visibly decaying, a favorite spot for trespassers and photographers, until it was finally demolished around 2013 to make way for what's now the Margaritaville Resort Orlando. Writers who covered the park during its operating years consistently praised the sheer craftsmanship on display, even while acknowledging the business model made little sense next to Disney's roller coasters and character meet and greets. One roadside attraction reviewer described it as delicate and out of step with its surroundings, a quiet, meticulously detailed experience that felt almost lost on an audience conditioned by far louder neighbors down the highway. The park's central feature, its half-mile Great Wall replica, built brick by miniature brick, became something of a photographer's pilgrimage site in the years after closure, with trespassers documenting its slow decay right up until the bulldozers finally arrived roughly a decade after the gates first closed for good. Number 3. Miracle Strip Amusement Park, Panama City Beach. Miracle Strip opened Memorial Day weekend of 1963, built around Florida's very first roller coaster, a wooden out-and-back ride called the Starliner, designed by legendary coaster architect John C. Allen. A small group of local Panama City Beach businessmen pooled together the money to build it, doubting at the time whether roller coasters, which had fallen out of fashion after World War II, would even work as a business anymore. Like much of the segregated South of that era, the park itself was not open to black visitors until the changes brought by the civil rights movement reached it in the late 1960s. The gamble on the Starliner paid off, and the park grew steadily around it for the next 4 decades, eventually featuring more than 30 rides. But Panama City Beach itself changed considerably over that same stretch, shifting from a family beach town into more of a spring break destination, and rising land values along the waterfront made the aging, modestly sized park an increasingly attractive target for condo developers. Miracle Strip closed for good on September 5th, 2004, after 41 years in operation. The Starliner itself was disassembled and relocated to Cypress Gardens in Winter Haven, reopening there in 2007, only to close again in 2008 when that park itself shut down. It's been in storage ever since, and by most accounts, will likely never run again. As one former visitor put it in an online tribute to the park years later, it wasn't really the rides people missed most, it was the park itself. For years after its closure, the empty Miracle Strip property became something of a local curiosity in its own right, with several of the park's more elaborate walk-through attractions, including a Dante's Inferno-themed dark ride and an abominable snowman-themed spinner attraction, left standing and slowly decaying in place rather than being demolished immediately. Photographers who documented the site in the years following closure described peeling paint, collapsed facades, and props that had once been designed to be spooky in a family-friendly way, taking on a genuinely unsettling quality once actual decay set in around them. Remarkably, despite the property sitting on some of the most valuable oceanfront real estate in the Florida Panhandle, the land remained largely undeveloped for well over a decade after the park's closure. A rare case of prime beachfront property simply sitting idle rather than being immediately snapped up by developers. Number 2. Wild Waters at Silver Springs. Sitting right next to Silver Springs, one of Florida's oldest and most famous natural attractions, Wild Waters opened in 1978 as a fairly conventional water park, with a wave pool, several water slides, and a lazy river designed to give families another reason to extend their visit beyond the glass-bottom boat tours Silver Springs was already famous for. For decades, it functioned as a reliable companion attraction, particularly popular with locals from nearby Ocala looking for a cheaper, closer alternative to the mega water parks in Orlando. Ownership changes eventually caught up with it. The state of Florida purchased Silver Springs in 2013 as part of an effort to fold the property into the surrounding state park system and better protect the natural spring itself, and Wild Waters, considered a separate commercial operation from the underlying park, closed that same year rather than being absorbed into the new state management structure. The pools and slides sat empty for years afterward, slowly deteriorating in the Florida climate, a quiet contrast to the still thriving natural springs a short walk away that continue to draw visitors for kayaking, snorkeling, and boat tours. Silver Springs itself has a considerably longer and stranger history than most people realize, having operated in some commercial capacity since the 1870s, making it one of the very first tourist attractions in the entire state, decades before anyone had heard of Orlando as a vacation destination. Generations of families who grew up visiting the glass-bottom boats often treated a stop at Wild Waters as the natural second half of the trip, cooling off after a morning spent looking down through crystal-clear spring water at fish and turtles below. When the state took over management and let the water park lapse, it effectively closed the book on that particular pairing, leaving Silver Springs to carry on purely as a nature-focused attraction, while Wild Waters became just another set of quietly crumbling pools, a short walk from a thriving, protected spring. Number 1. Gulf World Marine Park, Panama City Beach. Rounding out this list is the most recent entry by a wide margin, and proof that Florida is still adding to this particular graveyard of forgotten attractions even now. Gulf World Marine Park opened in May of 1970 in Panama City Beach, founded by a group of Alabama businessmen who initially kept their first captured bottlenose dolphins in a motel swimming pool while the actual park was still under construction. Over more than 5 decades, Gulf World grew into a genuine local institution, home to dolphin and sea lion shows, a penguin habitat, and one of the only facilities in the country housing rough-toothed dolphins, a considerably rarer species than the bottlenose dolphins most marine parks display. Gulf World closed permanently on May 27, 2025, after its parent company, the Dolphin Company, filed for bankruptcy amid mounting financial pressure across its network of marine parks. At the time of closure, the park was still drawing an estimated 150,000 visitors a year, a respectable number for a facility its size, which makes the sudden shutdown feel less like the slow fade of Ocean World decades earlier and more like a company simply running out of runway all at once. What happens to the property and to the animals that called it home for over 50 years is still being sorted out as of this recording, making Gulf World less a piece of settled Florida history and more a very fresh addition to it. It's worth pointing out just how different Gulf World's ending looks compared to almost everything else on this list. Ocean World, Africa, USA, and Pirates World all closed because of some combination of shrinking crowds, aging infrastructure, and changing tastes playing out gradually over years. Gulf World, by contrast, was reportedly still operating at reasonably healthy visitor numbers right up until its final season, undone less by a lack of interest from tourists and more by financial trouble at the corporate level. A reminder that even attractions with genuine, ongoing public demand aren't necessarily safe if the company running them gets into enough debt somewhere else in its portfolio. For over half a century, Gulf World sat quietly at the edge of Panama City Beach's amusement strip, close enough to Miracle Strip in its heyday that a single family day trip could easily have included both parks in the same afternoon. Now, decades apart, both are gone. The pattern behind the list: 10 very different attractions, closed across 7 different decades, and yet the same handful of reasons keep showing up over and over. Walt Disney World's 1971 arrival alone accounts for the decline of at least 4 of the parks on this list, pulling attention, money, and tourists north toward Orlando almost overnight. Shifting cultural tastes, whether it was westerns falling out of favor or marine mammal shows falling out of ethical fashion, quietly finished off a few more. And in more than one case, the land itself simply became worth more as condos or a shopping center than it ever was as a working attraction. There's also a pattern worth noting in just how little physical evidence most of these places left behind. Unlike some abandoned attractions elsewhere in the country that sit half-decayed and photographable for decades, most of Florida's lost parks were fully bulldozed within a few years of closing, their land immediately repurposed for housing, retail, or resort development, given how valuable Florida real estate has become. Splendid China and Miracle Strip both sat abandoned for a stretch before eventually meeting the wrecking ball, and Xanadu managed nearly a decade of decay before demolition finally came. But places like Circus World, Pirates World, and Six Gun Territory were largely erased from the map within just a year or two of shutting their gates, which is a big part of why so few Florida residents under a certain age have ever even heard these names, let alone visited any of them in person. None of these places show up on a Florida vacation itinerary anymore, and most of them left almost nothing behind for a curious visitor to actually go look at today. But for a certain generation of Floridians and Florida tourists, these 10 names still mean something, tucked away in old photo albums, faded ticket stubs, and the kind of memory that gets triggered the second someone mentions a dolphin doing a triple somersault or a half-mile replica of the Great Wall sitting 15 minutes from Disney World. Florida has never been shy about building big, strange, ambitious attractions. It's just been considerably less sentimental about what happens once the crowds stop showing up. If you enjoyed this look back at Florida's forgotten attractions, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the places that used to draw crowds and now barely draw a second glance.